Many years of living abroad have taught me that border runs are a safe, simple, and consistent system for being able to stay long-term in different countries, in different regions, and so forth. And all this time of being a traveler, and especially making a channel like this one, has also taught me that many people fear border runs and have a lot of misconceptions about them that make them worry this system isn't simple, isn't consistent, and so forth. But people around the world live based on these systems every day. And if they didn't work, society would break down at a lot of points and a lot of big changes would happen. This comes up because Costa Rica is kicking around the idea of making some modifications to their border run allowances. And it's only a proposal, so don't panic or anything, but keep an eye. If Costa Rica is a place that you are considering, it's good to keep up with what changes may be coming that would affect the mechanisms that you may use to stay there. And of course, every country changes these on a relatively regular basis. And having lived in Europe for a long time, a lot of the places that I lived in Europe either had their bordering countries or their own rules as far as their border runs change since or during the time that I was there. So we're very used to these things changing. You have to keep up and adjust how you do things based on that. But we have a note from Joseph McGruber, who sent in a number of questions in the past. We've done a number of videos for him, and so I wanted to dive into his concerns about border runs because I think there is a number of ideas about border runs that get missed, and often because there are so many people who are actually acting as illegal aliens in the U.S. parlance, or expats that are living without proper visas, and because of that, border runs seem more sketchy than they really are because there's some other activity that is actually a problem. And so one of the things I want to preface for this channel, because it comes up, especially when we're talking about things like border runs, is that the assumption is that everyone knows that we're talking about people who are not committing crimes. If you are a criminal, whether you are an illegal expat trying to stay without proper paperwork, or you are actively committing, horrible crimes, you're robbing the corner stores or whatever, you're a bank robber, then chances are you are aware that you are breaking those laws, and you should also be aware that it just goes without saying that when we say you're allowed to do things consistently, it does not mean you're allowed to break the law and still do those things consistently. It's funny that I have to preface with that, but we do. So let's read Joseph's letter and see what his concerns are about border runs. How are border runs supposed to work? Do you have to pack up all your earthly belongings and carry them across the border due to uncertainty as to whether to expect to receive another 90 days? That would really mess up getting a place to stay. Are we limited to day-to-day hotel room or staying at a hostel or volunteer place? No ability to make commitments or to sign an apartment lease? A decade ago, this really should be a second paragraph, a decade ago, I spent 2 and 3 months in Israel, a volunteer the second time. It was just over a year apart. My roommate there, the second visit to Israel, and who was also a volunteer, did a border run and received another 90 days. I would probably have tried that, but my family back home in the United States thought I should come back as they could not stay at my home any longer, so I just did my initial 90 days. They were there in my home because the schools here had a Spanish program that they wanted their sons into. Now they have dual passports, having also the citizenship of their dad. Only one of the volunteers actually had a volunteer visa. Everyone else simply tourist. I found it confusing the second time being told not to claim to be a volunteer. So what then was I supposed to tell them why I wanted to enter Israel? But again, I was allowed in. Well, let's start with the second part first. What you were is, in American terms, you were an illegal immigrant, right? So you were sneaking in and acting illegally, the same as anyone who sneaks into the United States but doesn't jump the border, right? There's 2 types of illegal immigrants. I'm using that term because Americans are familiar with it, but it is incorrect. You're not an immigrant. And whether you're illegal or not is a separate topic. But the idea is what Americans refer to as illegal immigrants, which are undocumented or improperly documented expats. Really, immigrants are essentially never illegal. That's not 100% true, but it's very, very rare. Generally, the concept of being an immigrant implies that you're legal at that point. Americans like to misuse that term, but we are not going to encourage it here. But we do need to remind people that that is what people mean when they use that term in the United States. That's what's going on here. So that's why this is confusing. You're feeling like you're supposed to come in that way. That's what was incorrect. You were working, even though it was a volunteer, and in Israel, volunteering, presumably, I am no expert on Israeli visas, is something that requires a special visa. Not a hard one to get, not one that they probably limit much at all, but it is required. And if you're here in Nicaragua, it is not required under normal circumstances. You can use a tourist visa to be a volunteer. That's generally okay, meaning it's allowed under the terms of the tourist visa. If they catch you, they're like, no, that's not catching you. We just found out. That's okay. Right? Now, working, completely different, but volunteering, yes. If you're volunteering but getting paid somehow, that's not really volunteering. So you can see where that gets confusing. But in Israel, you're supposed to have a volunteer visa. That's why there is a volunteer visa. So all those people who are coming in saying they were tourists when they were volunteers are doing so because they didn't get the proper visa and were illegal during their time there. Just because it's very unlikely to get caught with a tourist visa and being a volunteer does not change what it is. So that's why that felt insecure and why it felt like it was a weird process and you were wondering if you were going to be allowed in. Absolutely, it's because something was being done wrong, just not maliciously or very wrong, right? It's just didn't want to do the paperwork or didn't know to do the paperwork and so didn't, which is different than, say, smuggling people. But the reality is the same, that you were there undocumented for what you were doing. And had they actually been caught and audited, certainly you could have been deported because technically you were a criminal during that time. So if you're doing a border run, one of the expectations is you are legitimately doing a border run. You actually have the paperwork for what you are doing. You are doing it legally. You don't have to lie about anything or anything like that. Once you have to lie, then assume you have a problem and you can't do border runs. But ask yourself, under what situation do you need to lie? And there are certainly situations where that could be required to be able to get in because different places have different rules. And so that would make a system where, yes, you would have an unreliable border run. In this particular case, the discussion came up about border runs between Nicaragua and Costa Rica. Both are, at least currently, countries that completely allow border runs. There is no issues with legality. There is no specific issues with limits. There's no need to lie unless you are trying to do something like work illegally, but then that is a completely different thing altogether. Okay, so that's why your experience in Israel feels like an indicator that you would not have a reliable process elsewhere. I also want to preface this general concept with here in Central America, in much of South America, certainly in Southeast Asia, and in many other parts of the world, doing border runs is a normal, absolutely everyday process for huge swaths of expats who are completely legal and completely reliably living in those countries. It is simply a mechanism that I've talked about this in other videos to explain why countries are willing to use border runs as a security mechanism. It's just a very simple way to do things that they need to do, and it puts some of the effort on you. And if you're willing to go through that effort, they're willing to go through that effort, and they have different rules about it that they can easily change. And so it's a mechanism that actually works reasonably well, and not every country wants to do it, and it doesn't necessarily meet the requirements or the desires of every country as to how they want to balance tourist and long-term stays and so forth. But it's a mechanism that many countries find to be very useful, and of course they can adjust it very easily. So that is, you have to understand that in much of the world, this area especially, doing border runs is an everyday activity, and the average expat who lives in the zone does so through border runs. The average, right? The mean and the median. So yes, there are lots of people who are residents, but there are more formal, as we call them, formal residents, but more who are border runners. This can change quickly depending on very simple process and rule changes, but currently the system makes this tune towards border runs. It's just the thing that makes sense. Of course, you can always move away from border runs at any time. Right? Just go apply for your residency, switch off the border run system. And in many cases, you will also have a government that requires you to do so, and they will let you know. So the way they're supposed to work in countries where they're allowed, and this includes all of Europe, for example. I lived in Europe on a border run system for many years, and it worked absolutely perfectly. The reality is that most countries, the ones that we talk about, the ones where people are doing border runs, have completely consistent border run systems or border allowances. Meaning, if you're coming to Nicaragua, you're not going to get turned away unless, again, you're a criminal. If you're here truly to be a tourist, even if that's a long-term one that may stay indefinitely, that's not just something that they will overlook. That's something that they're hoping for, as long as you're not a criminal, of course. So if that's what you're coming to do, well, I'm coming to stay. I want to stay 90 days. I'm hoping to get an extension to 180. I'd like to do a border run. I'd like to stay 180 more. If you told this to the border agent in Nicaragua, one, that's oversharing and get over the desire to do that, but don't be dishonest either. Just tell them answer their questions and let them ask what they want to know. But if that's what they knew you were planning on doing, they wouldn't turn you away. They'd say, oh, excellent. I'm glad you're following the law. Welcome to Nicaragua, right? This is not skirting a system. This is the system here and in much of the world. And so all you have to do is follow the rules, and you get in very consistently. If you're going to run into a problem, it is basically guaranteed that that problem will be the first time you come into the country, or that you've done so many border runs, and this goes worldwide, that you've done so many border runs that someone is going to tell you that you need to get formal residency because they only want to do it so much. Some countries have unlimited border runs, many, and many others have limited numbers of border runs. Places like Nicaragua do have a limit, but it's not a hard limit, so everyone ends up hitting it at a different point depending on a lot of factors, right? We talk about that a bit, but it is completely reliable during the time that you're doing things. We've never heard even a rumor of someone who was denied entry, except for a case where they were initially denied entry and they were never able to come in the first place, which could be any number of things. We rarely hear what the reason is. They don't necessarily tell you. Or someone who is then later being denied, there's always this hint of, well, we kind of knew there was something illegal, maybe we didn't know the details, and when asked, either we get told, well, yeah, there was this crime involved, or something was done externally that is considered illegal here, so you wouldn't be, like, they completely knew that they were risking not being allowed in, or they just go silent and don't want to admit that there was actually a reason and they were not expecting to come in. A lot of people create problems intentionally because they want to get in the news or get into, post on Reddit or whatever and have themselves as an example because they didn't really want to come back, but they wanted to get denied. And in many cases, I think people can get paid for doing that. And so it's very easy to create a situation intentionally where you would be kicked out of anywhere, but it's not being kicked out. It's simply not being allowed back in, the same as any tourist who's not allowed in the first time, which doesn't normally get reported anywhere. Here, it tends to be a big deal because the U.S. is always looking for news items to talk about this. So this first thing that he asked, do you have to pack up all your earthly belongings and carry them across the border? No, absolutely not. People don't do that. No one does that, right? Remember, the average person who lives here and in much of these countries, right, Europe, Southeast Asia, they never do that. They never worry about that. It never even really comes up as a concern, right? If you had a house full of stuff here and they deny you at the border, even if that were to happen, which I've literally never heard of, but it absolutely could, then you have a couple choices. One is talk to them and be like, okay, what can I do to come in and get that stuff? Right? Can I get a 5-day visa? Can I get a, something so I can go collect my things and move on? Or presumably you will know someone in country, have them pack those things up and drive them to the border, have them pack them up and ship them to you. There's a lot of options, right? If I was to have this happen here, it's not something that we've really had to consider, right? But what if that did happen? Now, we're not on a border run system, right? But we were for a long time until we got our residency. That's what you do. And during that time, we still had a house full of goods. We still had dogs here. We still had things that we were not going to leave behind. What would we do? Well, that's actually pretty simple. We would have one of our friends here sell anything that is not important to keep, right? Oh, we have a stove that we bought here. We have a refrigerator. We just sell them, send us the cash. We don't want to ship that stuff around. Of the small things that really matter, our personal effects and so forth that weren't with us, our clothing and stuff, and of course the dogs, we would have them all put in a vehicle and driven to the border. For us, most likely the Honduran border, but it could go any which way. And of course, any car that can cross the border can head up to Guatemala. So we'd have a number of countries to potentially choose from, and we just pay for someone's gas to drive it around. Is that a big inconvenience? Yeah, we are talking about being kicked out of the country that you're currently that you are currently living in. So it's not a trivial thing, but it's so unbelievably unlikely that while it's more likely than the wings falling off your airplane, it falls into that kind of category that this isn't something that you really do a lot of planning around. You don't sit around worrying about what's going to happen should I get denied a return into the country that I'm living in, unless you are committing crimes and have an expectation of something coming up and flagging you for re-entry problems. you assume you're going to be able to come back in, and if you are going to run into problems, mostly you're going to get a warning ahead of time. Well, we're going to let you in this time, but this is your last time. Oh, okay, on this trip I need to move my stuff. You would generally have that warning. So people who are coming in and doing this really don't sit around worrying and planning for what would I do if I had to liquidate my items at home. Right? It's just not a real world concern. Same thing with airplanes. Like if the wings are going to fall off, yeah, it could happen. When's the last time that happened? You can't plan around it. One, you have no good way to action having that plan, and two, it doesn't change the actual safety of the airplane, right? It doesn't matter that you could be blocked at the border. The reality is that the process is very reliable, and so you don't have to worry about that. So the risk of that is already calculated into anything, and you can be deported from anywhere, anytime. This is just the rule, right? The idea that you're allowed to stay in any country, sometimes even the one you're born in, actually isn't a granted right. Now, if it's the country you were born in, you're going to have a way better time avoiding deportation than some other country, right? Where you are simply a guest or you got a green card or something. But even then, the government always has the power to simply decide you're not welcome anymore and ship you to a border, sometimes a random border, right? That is always a risk. There's no such thing as avoiding that risk. It feels like border runs create that risk. It feels like you're safe until you do a border run. And when you do a border run, you are triggering an event where now you're at risk. That is a false impression. In some cases where it is a very light thing, the government would, who wants to deport you from anywhere, will say, well, you know what, they're on a 90-day visa. We're going to let it expire because there's only so many days left. Why go through this process? We'll end up making them stay longer because we're going to do something weird. Make them cross the border. If they don't voluntarily cross the border and get denied re-entry, then we're going to arrest them for overstaying their visa, and we don't even have to talk about the reason we wanted to get rid of them. Now they're a flat-out criminal, no question, black and white, easy. Right, so that's why in a border run situation, you often see things happen at the time of a border run. That's when they're taking legal action because it's just convenient, and that's when they know that they have you at a spot where you have to interact with the police naturally. Imagine if you were any type of parole jumper and you had to check in with your parole officer, which is a cop, once a week or something. If you jump bail, if you jump parole and you don't show up, or you don't do some things you're supposed to do they run and try to find you? If you're a violent criminal, maybe, but you're not probably on parole then. Do they, chase you down, or do they wait to see if you check in and then have a conversation with you then, or then use the didn't show up to your meeting to have a really easy way to come get you, right? Most likely they're going to do that in most circumstances. Of course, if you're committing a heinous crime, they're going to come get you immediately, right? We're talking about, well, yeah, we would deport them, but this would be more convenient to do it then. That's all we're talking about. But if you had residency, they would just come to your house and deport you. If you had citizenship, they would just come to your house and deport you anywhere. This is any country, anywhere in the world. If that's what they want to do, they're going to do it. You don't have a concept of a guaranteed right to stay. So that's an important thing. People feel this, and a lot of these YouTube channels sell residency paperwork as some kind of guarantee, which is 100% fake. That is a scam. It is a common scam. There's tons of channels, and you know what they sound like. They have names that tend to have, capitalist in the name, or, traveler, or world, or nomad, right? They're going to have there's just so many, and they have these words in their name, and they go after people who feel like they need to think in these terms, and they sell concepts because they've already got you. They've got these titles, and you come in, and then they're like, wow, these are people who are feeling like they need some kind of assurance. And so they start selling residency and citizenship consulting or services to get it, and they'll lead you down the garden path. And we know people here in Nicaragua who went to some of these channels and were sold on completely fake ideas, moved to Nicaragua, never did any research on their own, had no idea that the country didn't offer the types of paperwork that they were here to get. And they had invested years, bought businesses, all kinds of things, spent hundreds of thousands of dollars, and never checked with anybody official, and had no idea that the path they were on would never lead to what they were looking for. So these kinds of things are very important to understand, that one, every country is different, and two, You will never have an actual assurance. If you feel that you have a guarantee, that is a false impression. And if you feel that border runs are a particular risk, that is also a false impression. Border runs are not an extra risk. They just feel that way because of the way we interact with them. So don't look at an option of doing border runs as being particularly risky. It's just not the way that it is. It actually is a very solid, stable mechanism that you can reliably use and not have to really worry about it. And that's what so many people in all the countries in this region are doing all the time. It got a little bit sunny and warm. He says that would really mess up getting a place to stay. Are we limited to day-to-day hotel rooms or staying at a hostel or volunteer place? No ability to make commitments or to sign an apartment lease. Okay, so this is again very important to understand that where you're talking about, whoa, we got a lot of wind. It's important to understand that what you're talking about is what everyone you know who's hunting for a long-term apartment lease is doing. They're all on the border run system, or nearly all. It's very rare that you're going to encounter someone, especially here in Nicaragua, who's talking about getting an apartment or trying to find a place, looking for help in doing so, that is not on the border run system. Now, many of them may be considering residency in the future. Absolutely. It's an option that should be kept open and doesn't go away just because you're on a border run system to start. Everyone essentially starts on the border run system. And one could make a really good argument that everyone starts on the border run system, because until you have residency, you need to do a border run after a maximum of 180 days. No ifs, ands, or buts. So when you first arrive on that first day as a tourist, technically you're on a border run system. You just haven't done your first border run yet. You could get residency during that time, but until it comes through, you're on the border run system in a way, right? So it's an important thing to understand that anyone who has residency has lived here long enough that they probably aren't talking to others about how to find an apartment or anything like that, because they've done it one or more times. They've been around for at least several months, if not several years, and they have resources of their own and know what they're looking for and have put in time naturally seeing places and know what it is that they might want. So what you have almost always is people who are on the border run system trying to do all those things that you're worried about. Of course, people on border run systems do, without thinking, without hesitation, getting 6, 12, 24-month leases. They're buying furniture for those places. They're putting in the time. There's absolutely no reason to hesitate at that. No reason to let it cross your mind as a concern. You don't need to. In the same way that if you have your residency, you shouldn't be like, well, but my residency renews every year, right? The border run, you have to deal with every 180 days. If you have residency, you still have to do something every 180 days, which is just a reprint of a piece of paper, but it is a thing you have to do, and it's annoying. And every year, if you're on, say, retirement or a regular style visas, you got to renew them. If you're married, it's different. And if you're an investor, then it's a longer period of time, but it still has to renew. So there's different lengths of time. All of them have something, though, that happens every 6 months, and all of them have the option of not being renewed. They all have the possibility that they will not extend you by choice at that barrier. But all of them also have the possibility that they will deport you at any moment if you've done something wrong or policy changes. And all of them have the possibility, the likelihood, the understood default state that you will stay for as long as you want. And so reacting to them and saying, oh no, this is a terrible thing. Border runs sound scary. Mostly they sound scary because either they are completely misunderstood, that's one thing, or there are tons of people who are trying to sell residency services, whether it's a lawyer or an advisor or a YouTuber. They're making money either by creating panic so people watch their videos, or creating a source of income directly by selling you services and advice on getting those things that you probably don't need. So they have to create this false sense of border runs being scary or unreliable to make you feel that you need to do those things, and to get you to not trust that all the people, the thousands upon thousands of people in Nicaragua, as an example, who use border runs today, are somehow at risk of something that none of them have thought of, and that none of the people who've been doing border runs time immemorial have had to deal with. So it's just, we all experience, a lot of people who have not done it feeling that border runs were scary. But no one that we know that does them feels that way. Some feel that it is an inconvenience, and depending on where you live, who you are, they could be less convenient than getting a residency. So some people switch to residency because of convenience. Some people want to stay on border runs because of convenience. It really depends on you. For us, we found border runs to be so easy and convenient that really, from that perspective, we wanted that over residency. Residency came with some other benefits, and we got a better residency because we are investors, so it's a little bit less work. So there's things that made the residency make sense. Plus, we know this is our long-term home. People doing border runs in Nicaragua typically are people who are still either going through the residency process and just need some time to work that out, or people who are feeling it out, or people who are short-termers and for whom it would not make sense to go through the residency process because by the time they got it, they would be done and ready to leave. For example, if you know you want to live in Nicaragua for a year and a half, you do border runs. Doing a residency process for that amount of time seems really silly. That's only 2 renewals. And on that last renewal, it's easy to come in and say, look, this is my final one. I just want to come in for this last time and I'm done. I'm not trying to get residency. I'm not trying to live here. And that'll make it that much easier, right? Like, okay, last time. And they'll probably mark somewhere, don't let him back in for some amount of time, or, you know, make him get residency before he does, or whatever, right? They can do that. And so it really is that we typically see people who are feeling it out, establishing their base, doing some investment or whatever. They'll stay on the border runs and then naturally want to move to residency once it makes sense for them or it is required, but they'll be informed. And then in Costa Rica, I think what we're seeing quite a bit is people who do it kind of indefinitely, and that's why Costa Rica is potentially reacting to that. But you have massive amounts of population who don't care about having the residency paperwork down there, and so Costa Ricans do this border run often indefinitely, and that's what they're potentially looking to curtail. These are very reliable systems that have been going on for a long time. And of course, Guatemala, same thing happens. Belize, same thing happens. Mexico, Panama, like in this region, border runs are very standard, very well known, and very accepted. So each country has its own quirks, has their own little things that you need to know. Sometimes, like in the EU, where border runs are an indefinite thing, where there's a hard rule and they never question it, but they do a 90 in, 90 out. So if you want to be in Europe, you can be there half the time. You can live in Europe half time with no other paperwork, but you can never live there full time until you get residency. This is the EU and the Schengen, of course. So if you're in that European area and that's a place you want to be quite a bit of time, automatically, as long as you, again, not a criminal, you get to stay there and have an allowed passport, of course. Like as an American, I can go to Europe and live for 3 months. Then I have to leave the Schengen zone for 3 months, and best to do it and a day, just to be absolutely sure, and then return for 3 months again. I get to live half the year, 180 days, in the Schengen. No paperwork, no questions asked, no problem, indefinitely. Now, a lot of people find that inconvenient, and a lot of other people find it absolutely amazing because it requires them to live in different places on a regular basis, and that's super fun for a lot of people. So that's a thing that sometimes people just make that fit into their lives. And when we lived there, we would do things like live in the Schengen for 3 months and then switch out of the Schengen, but only go over a nearby border because there used to be non-Schengen countries all throughout the region. Now there's many fewer than there used to be, so it's a lot more limited, and those that are outside the Schengen, many of which are currently war zones, that makes it much less attractive to do that right at this particular moment. But in the general sense, because we did live in Ukraine as one of our countries as we moved around in the region over a period of time, and it was at war at the time, but not like it is now, so it was not the scary situation as it would be. We didn't have to really worry about bombs falling on us during our time there, but it was a wonderful experience, and we loved using the border run system when we weren't making a permanent home. Now, when we moved to Nicaragua, we did make a decision that this was our long-term permanent home, and we knew that at some point we were going to move towards residency formally. And that's exactly what we did. We did the border runs for a number of years. When the time came, we moved into residency. That was our plan. So that's probably what you will do if you decide to come to Nicaragua. But if you're going to another country, the idea that you would stay on a border run system for forever, absolutely fine. Tons of people in Southeast Asia do that. And if the system ever changes, if you're ever at risk of that, you'll simply move into a residency or some other process for that country specifically. Again, every country is different, so your mileage will vary, but the system of border runs is a reliable one. Don't be worried about it. Thanks for joining me. Like and subscribe. If you'd like to help support the channel, you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Scott Alan Miller. Down in our show notes, we have a lot of information, including, most important, we have a GoFundMe. We are raising money for my producer, Marcela, who has stage 4 Hodgkin lymphoma. We need to raise about $5,000 to get her through the next 2 years. She's a single mother. She has 2 kids at home and a lot of logistics that need help because she is so sick. Her healthcare is taken care of by Nicaragua, which is a godsend, but there's still a lot that she needs help with. So we're trying to raise funds for her, and you guys have been fantastic. We've raised, I believe, a bit over half. I think we're almost to 60%, like $3,000 total of the $5,000 that we're trying to raise. So we are definitely getting there pretty quickly. If you need to contact me, information's in the show notes. If you would like to, and this is fantastic, make a video of yourself and send it in with a question rather than writing a question out. We love it when people do that, so consider doing that. Information is in the show notes. Other channels that I have, including Nicaragua 360 with 360-degree views of different parts of the country, in the show notes. Drive Warp, another show, My Camera Cafe, just a place to talk about cameras. All those things in the show notes. Lots of great information in there. And as always, get in the comments, say hello if nothing else, ask your questions, share this with someone on social media or with a family friend, or better, both. Watch another episode after this to help support the show, and I will see all of you tomorrow.